So in this video, I'll show you a little tool I've created to do STMap and iDistort significantly faster when you have a lot of details in your UVs. For example, in the STMap, going from speeds like this to this. And in the iDistort map, or iDistort node, going from speeds like this. I'm not even gonna wait, to this. So here the other day at VFX, I was helping out a fellow artist who had problems with a lot of render time fluctuation in one of his comps. The thing is, most of the frames were rendering out a couple of seconds per frame, really good. And then some of the frames would take minutes and minutes and minutes to render. And looking through the comp of this person, there's really sort of good best practices thing, trying to keep all the bounding boxes as sort of a minimum, doing good channel management, only applying effects to the right channels that are actually needed to have the effects applied. So really nice and tidy script. And so one of the things I found out was that there is this group node that would source a bunch of pre-comped UVs. And these UVs would change from being sort of fairly low complexity to something really, really high complexity. And these iDistort nodes, of course, when you have a lot of detail in iDistort or STMap nodes, it will actually cause the comp to grind to a halt. Perfect example of this is in this case, where we have, I have created this, these sort of normals from just a bunch of noise and a little bit of blur, and I can control the sort of the detail of the noise by just changing the blur here. And if I use the iDistort just in the base thing here, right, it renders fairly fast. But as I reduce the blur size, this thing just becomes slower and slower and slower. And at some point, it'll take multiple seconds to render a single frame. Even though, I haven't really changed anything except for the blur. So theoretically, it should actually be faster to render because, the thing I'm actually rendering is significantly smaller. And that's of course one of the drawbacks. There are of course ways around this. You can change the filter method from cubic to impulse, but that just causes this thing to flicker like madness. And in many cases, you will have so much undersampling that you just don't get enough to get in there. There are certain other tools that allows you to do sort of a middle way between the two. iDistort is a really, really good node that allows you to get some of that back. You get significantly better performance while also have a lot of detail. But in certain scenarios where you have a lot of small high frequency detail, it's simply not enough to have that, and you really sort of much rather have a little bit of oversampling compared to undersampling. And so I've created this tool that actually allows you to do a little bit of oversampling that is significantly faster. And so just to show you, this is how long time it takes to render the basic iDistort node, and this is the fast complexity filter, right? So rather than taking seconds per frame, it will actually render at multiple frames per second. Of course, it is you don't get better performance if you increase the detail or lower the detail. The thing is, you can increase the detail as much as you like, and you will still have the same performance on the render. And so before I'll go into this node, I'll just, in case you don't know what's going on and the reason why this occurs, I'll just show you that. And the reason why the STMap and the iDistort map is really, really slow when you got a lot of detail is because it's actually really, really smart. If you imagine sort of a scene like this where you have a bunch of domes here, and you can imagine they were being instead of just diffuse, they would be really reflective, and they were reflect the sky, and you can imagine a place like here. That particular place, right, they'll probably have some normals that would move in this direction, and you can imagine there's high likelihood that they would probably sample something in this perimeter, right? And you might be lucky enough to get a little bit of that moon up here, reflected off in the surface here, and then around it you will see some of that beautiful blue sky here around it, and it'll be reflected like that. That's beautiful. And so as the moon moves across the sky, just have this thing move across. Perfect. Right. The problem is, of course, depending on sort of the density of this thing, if this thing was like a much more, I guess you can say, a much more curved surface. So if it's like a flat surface, right, you have a lot of like equal distance point, like if you have each point like so far between, it would be like something like that. If the surface is curved, then each point, well, of course, there will be more distance between each point. Like from here to here, it'll be much steeper. And if you have like a sort of very curved surface, you will have, you know, much longer between each point. And so if you like can imagine like 4 points, like these 4 points that are like trying to, I guess, well, these 4 points on the original thing that is trying to reflect the moon up here, right? If you have these 4 points, right, you can imagine there'll be like these 4 points. In this case, they would actually, you know, do a fairly good job of actually sampling the moon. So one of them would be white and some of them would be blue, because that's the color of the sky. But as this thing curves more and more and more, right, you'll get more and more distance between each sample point. And at some point, you will actually not have a sample point that actually reaches the moon. And so if you were like very naive and just say, okay, I just need like every single point should just represent 1 pixel, right? Then you will have just a blue thing because it doesn't reach the moon. And so as the moon moves across the surface of this thing, if you can imagine these four sample points, so all of a sudden you'll have a really bright spot because that's the moon, right? Because this point is being covered. And then all of a sudden it'll just go dark again. So you'll have this flickering thing. And that's actually what's happening inside the iDistort node when you turn on the impulse thing. And so that'll just cause this thing to flicker like crazy, right? And so that's usually why you don't do that. And so what makes the iDistort node and the STMap node really, really smart is that when you don't use impulse, but use cubic or any other method, it will actually sample every single point inside of here. And so as this thing increases, it will just make this region bigger and bigger and bigger. And so in case of like cubic, it will, you know, this pixel down here will just sample, you know, an area like this, and this pixel up here will sample an area like this. And if you have like a much smoother sampling method, it will maybe take the whole thing. And so that means that no matter where you are, or no matter where the moon is in your area, it will still have a contribution. So the surface will always have that moon somewhere in it. And so if you have like a nice glow or something like that, you will not get like a lot of flicker or like a pulsating thing when it moves across the surface. It will like be a uniform effect that goes when it moves across sort of the glancing angle of this thing. So that is really, really smart. The problem is, of course, once the sort of the density of this thing will get bigger. You can imagine these things, right? Imagine a surface that is like this. So if you have like a sort of highly detailed surface, as you add more and more detail, you can imagine a point like this thing here, right? That will like have something like this, and this thing will have a thing like this, right? So there's like a really large distance between each single point, right? And so that means that the sample point you will have is, rather than this thing, right, it will be something like this, right? So all of a sudden you will have like 400 by 400 pixels that you need to sample in order to just figure out that there's a moon in there's site in there in some area. Now, as I said, there are things like iDistort, which does a really, really nice job. And what iDistort does, which is really smart, is rather than just sampling these 4 points, right, it will actually sample sort of just a line in between. So there's a sort of much higher chance that it will actually sample the moon that is inside there, which is really smart. And in theory, you could just add more of these stripes, right, in order to get sort of a higher sort of sample density, and then just add a bunch of points here that you sample. But it's, of course, you know, the more of these things you add, the more expensive it'll become. But there is sort of a way that you can do this that does not sort of slow down, where you have like a constant speed, where you still have a full coverage. And one of the methods you can do that is actually what's going on here. This thing here. As you can see, there's a bunch of reformat nodes that all goes into a blink script node. And so if you think about this thing here, right, what we need to do is we need to have this 400 by 400 pixel area that we need to sample. And we need to reduce this so we don't sample as many pixels. But we still want to know, is the moon in there? what we can do is that we can actually just reformat, if I can get that. If we reformat this thing down to half scale, and then take the half of the half, that's quarter, and then half and half and half and half and half. And at some point we have just roughly what is covered by, you know, 4 pixels here, let's say. So what was before, like 260 by 260 pixels, is now a 2 by 2 pixel grid. But we still have the contribution of the moon. In fact, it's averaged down. So we have the same contribution that we will get by sampling all of the pixels in here. So if we add this and say if the surface is, you know, rough enough so that we need to sample this area, what we do is we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 levels down and sample this particular thing, because then we don't only need to sample 2 pixels. In case we only needed to sample an area like this, we go down to level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And in case we had something more detailed, we could go to a lower level, right? Or higher level, that is. And so this is actually what it does. It will break this thing down to multiple resolution buckets. I guess you could say mipmaps, like they do in gaming. And it will just make it constant speed, because it will only need to sample 4 pixels no matter how detailed this thing is. So you can increase the detail, you can reduce the detail, and it'll work like that. And of course, this works both in iDistort and STMap node. So in case you have an STMap, like here, we have this highly reflective surface, and it also takes a significant amount of time to render. But if we use the fast complex distort, it will actually render pretty fast. And you know, they're fairly close in look. Of course, they are not exactly the same, and the reason why I'll just show you in a minute. The reason why they're not the same, and the reason why this is not like the end-all be-all solution to this problem, is of course, in the case of this thing, we have 4 pixels, and they are of course not, to emphasize it, they are most likely never going to be 4 points that look like this, oh sorry, hardness, there you go, there, and there. Most likely, in this case, they will most likely be something like this, and this. So if you can imagine a situation where you have something like here, you have a sample point here, you have a sample point here, you have a sample point here, right? If we use the downscaling method, we would actually sample this whole thing, because that's the box that's inside. But in the case of the iDistort, it will actually do like this. So you will get a bit of oversampling. Now, in most cases, that will probably be preferred, I guess, compared to undersampling, because you don't get any sort of strobing or anything like that. But in case you need that extra detail, you might need to, you know, shell out with actually having sort of the whole thing with the render time being completely bogged down. But in case you don't need that, I think solutions like this, by doing a mipmap-based approach, could definitely help you if you need a lot of detail. Of course, if you don't need a lot of detail, there's no need to do that. I guess iDistort would be a little bit faster. So again, it all depends. And of course, you don't have all the nice filter methods. But that could, of course, easily be implemented if you like to. So this is the fast iDistort and STMap. Not sure what to call it, but it's just fast complexity iDistort, or fast complexity distort. Yeah, so have fun.